On the night of December 3, 1834, the Ashfield local was scheduled to arrive at precisely 1:13 a.m. It never did. Witnesses claimed they saw the train's lanterns through the fog that night, heard the low whistle echoing over the moor, and then nothing. No wreckage. No survivors. The tracks were found undamaged, stretching into the mist as if the train had simply vanished into the air. For 50 years, it remained nothing more than a fireside tale told to frighten children. Until Samuel Rourke saw the men. If you enjoy the darkness, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what keeps you up at night. It was already snowing when Samuel stepped off the carriage. The Ashfield station was little more than a single wooden platform, the paint peeling, the lanterns flickering in the wind. He pulled his wool coat tighter, the damp air biting at his skin. The station master, a gaunt figure in a heavy scarf, handed him the keys without ceremony. Keep the fire stoked. Trains don't come through much after dark. Samuel glanced at the empty schedule board. I thought the Midnight Express still passed through. The station master's eyes flicked to the tracks, then back to Samuel. It's not on the schedule for a reason. He spent his first night unpacking in the small station master's quarters, a room no bigger than a pantry, with frost creeping along the inside of the windows. Outside, the snow thickened. Just past midnight, Samuel awoke to the distant sound of a whistle. Low. Mournful. He stepped to the window, heart pounding. Through the swirling fog, he saw the silhouette of a man on the platform. Tall, wearing a long coat, perfectly still despite the wind. When Samuel opened the door to call out, the platform was empty. The snow beneath the man's feet was untouched. The wind had shifted by morning, bringing with it a brittle, cutting cold. Ashfield looked different in daylight, if it could be called daylight. The pale sun was little more than a white coin smudged behind low clouds, and the world was steeped in a flat gray that made the snow seem even whiter. Samuel stepped out onto the platform with a steaming tin mug of tea in his hand. From the far end of the tracks, the moor rolled away into mist, an unbroken expanse of whiteness punctuated only by the occasional skeletal tree. It was a view that should have been calming. Instead, it carried a strange tension, as though something might emerge from that fog at any moment. A pair of villagers trudged past on the path that ran alongside the station. They nodded politely, but didn't stop to talk. Samuel had noticed that nobody lingered at the station if they didn't have to. He finished his tea and decided to take a walk through the village. Ashfield wasn't large, 2 rows of narrow houses with dark brick chimneys, a single pub, a church with a leaning steeple, and a small grocer's shop with frost-caked windows. Inside the grocer's, the smell of dried herbs and pickled vegetables wrapped around him like a blanket. The shopkeeper, a woman in her 50s with a kerchief tied over her hair, gave him a long look before speaking. "You're the new station master," she said, more a statement than a question. "That's right. Samuel Rourke." She nodded once, then busied herself behind the counter. "Cold season's early this year. Keep the lamps full and the coal dry." He bought a loaf of bread and a small jar of honey, then lingered a moment longer. "Tell me," he said casually, "what do you know about the train that went missing? The one in 34. Her hands froze mid-motion, the jar of preserves in her grip trembling slightly. "Best to leave that be, Mr. Rourke. It's not a story to pass the time with. Humor me." The woman's eyes darted to the front window, where the snow was starting to fall again. "They say the conductor was a proud man. Wouldn't heed warnings about the fog on the moor. Some claim the train hit something that shouldn't have been there. Others say it was taken." Taken. Her gaze hardened. "Not everything that comes into Ashfield leaves it. Remember that." That night, after the station was closed, Samuel explored the office beyond the ticket counter. The place was a museum of outdated timetables and yellowing notices. In the bottom drawer of a rusted filing cabinet, he found the station logbook, a heavy ledger bound in cracked leather, its pages edged in dust. Most entries were unremarkable: cargo manifests, passenger counts, weather notes. But as he turned the pages, he began to notice a pattern. Every so often, without explanation, there was an entry at 1:13 a.m. No train name. No destination. No remarks. Just the time, written in a hand that seemed almost hesitant. The earliest of these unexplained entries was dated December 10, 1834, a week after the vanished train. The latest was just 6 months ago. Samuel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ledger as the wind howled outside. He told himself it had to be a prank, or some station master's private joke. Yet, as the hours ticked toward midnight, he felt the same uneasy pull that had woken him the night before. At 1:05 a.m., he put on his coat and stepped onto the platform. The snow was falling in thick, silent sheets now, muffling the world. He paced the length of the station, his breath forming white clouds in the cold air. 1:12. The fog began to gather, not drifting in slowly as fog should, but rolling in like a wave, swallowing the far end of the tracks. 1:13. A figure stood there. The same man. Tall, long coat, brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. Samuel's mouth went dry. He took a cautious step forward. The man didn't move. The snow around his boots was untouched, pristine. Another step. And then, from somewhere deep within the fog, a faint sound began to rise, the distant chime of a bell. Samuel froze. The man's head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as though bending toward him in recognition. Samuel did not sleep after the bell. He sat at his small desk in the station master's quarters until dawn, the ledger open before him, the inked 1:13 glaring from the pages like a repeated curse. Outside, the snow stopped just before sunrise, leaving the village blanketed in white. The fog, however, lingered, curling between the houses and along the tracks as if it had no intention of leaving. By mid-morning, he found himself at the church. It was a squat, stone building at the top of a small hill, its steeple leaning slightly eastward. The heavy oak doors groaned as he pushed them open. Inside, the air was dry and smelled faintly of wax. A handful of candles burned near the altar, where an elderly vicar was arranging him books. "You're the new station master," the vicar said without turning around. Samuel nodded. "I wanted to ask about the bell." That got the vicar's attention. He turned slowly, his pale eyes sharp despite his years. "We haven't rung that bell in decades, Mr. Rourke. Not since before I was born. I heard it last night." The old man's face darkened. "You didn't hear it from here. If you value your sanity, you'll stay indoors when the fog is thick, and you'll ignore anything you hear, bells, whistles, voices. Especially voices." Samuel felt a cold ripple crawl up his spine. "Why?" The vicar lowered his voice. "Because they are not calling to you. They're calling for you." That evening, Samuel locked the station early. He lit the coal stove in his quarters, but even with the fire roaring, the chill in the air refused to fade. At 1 a.m., he gave in to the pull and stepped outside. The fog was denser than the night before, swallowing the lamps in milky halos. He followed the tracks toward the moor, boots crunching in the snow. 1:08. Somewhere far ahead, a faint whistle echoed. It wasn't the shrill call of a modern locomotive, it was deeper, older, resonant with metal and steam. 1:12. The air thickened until Samuel could barely see his hands in front of him. His breath came out in clouds that seemed to hang motionless. And then, through the haze, he saw a shape, a dark, looming bulk that stretched across the tracks. A train. Its lanterns glowed a sickly yellow, cutting only a few feet into the fog. Samuel could make out the outline of the engine, its iron ribs gleaming wetly, steam hissing from unseen vents. The sound of its machinery was wrong, too slow, as if each piston stroke strained against some unseen weight. The tall man stood beside the first carriage. His coat fluttered faintly in a wind Samuel could not feel. This time, his face was visible beneath the brim of his hat, gaunt, pale, eyes like pits of shadow. The man lifted a gloved hand and gestured toward the open carriage door. Samuel's feet moved before his mind caught up. One step onto the platform, another toward the train. And then, from within the carriage, something moved. At first, he thought it was smoke. Then the smoke resolved into shapes, figures, hunched and shivering, their faces obscured. They pressed toward the door, and Samuel realized with a lurch that they were whispering. The words were indistinct, overlapping, but the tone was urgent, pleading. The men in the coat stepped aside, making room. Samuel reached the first step of the carriage. The whispers grew louder. A hand shot out from the darkness inside, thin, gray, with nails black as coal, and seized his wrist. The cold that surged into him was not the cold of winter. It was the cold of earth, of something buried deep where no sunlight had touched for centuries. He yanked his arm free and stumbled back. The tall man's smile widened, impossibly, until it split his face like a wound. The whistle sounded again, this time so loud it rattled Samuel's bones. The fog surged forward, swallowing the train, the men, and the whispering figures. When it cleared, Samuel was alone on the tracks. The morning after his second encounter, Samuel's wrist still ached where the gray hand had gripped him. No bruise, no mark, but the skin there felt wrong. Cold, as if something inside was slowly leaching away his warmth. He kept glancing toward the tracks while tending to his duties at the station, but the fog had lifted for now, and the moor lay bare under a pale winter sun. Even in daylight, the memory of the train's shadowed carriages gnawed at him. By mid-afternoon, Samuel had made up his mind. If he was going to make sense of what he'd seen, he needed records, more than the station's ledger could give him. There was only one place in Ashfield that might have them, the town archives. The archives were kept in the basement of the parish hall, a squat stone building that smelled faintly of mildew. The caretaker, a man named Pritchard with watery blue eyes, seemed reluctant to hand over the keys, but Samuel's official station master badge gave him enough authority to press the matter. The basement was colder than the air outside. Narrow shelves lined the walls, each stacked with ledgers, maps, and bundles of yellowed newspapers tied with string. Samuel lit a kerosene lamp and began searching. Hours passed before he found what he was looking for, a bound volume labeled Rail Incidents, 1830 to 1840. The leather was cracked, the spine barely holding. He sat at a small wooden table, the lamp's glow flickering over the brittle pages. Most entries were mundane, delays due to snow, livestock on the tracks, the occasional mechanical fault. Then, on December 3, 1834, the handwriting changed. 1:13 a.m., Ashfield local failed to arrive. Weather, heavy fog. No contact from crew. Tracks inspected, clear. Proceeded 2 miles toward moor, visibility near zero. Heard whistle twice, but no visual. Returned at dawn. All records of Ashfield local to be sealed per directive from Rail Office, London. Beneath that, in the margin, someone had scrawled in smaller, hurried letters. They took the train. The men in the coat watches. Samuel traced the faded ink with his finger. He flipped forward and found other oddities, sporadic reports over the decades of sightings in the fog, a lantern light on the tracks, a shadowy figure stepping from the mist. All dismissed, all buried in the archives. And then, in the year 1861, one entry froze him in place. Contact made with survivor. Male, approximate 40, claims to have been aboard Ashfield local in 34. Says, it isn't a train, not anymore. Interview terminated, subject unresponsive. The survivor's name was listed, Walter Briggs. The archives gave no further detail, but Samuel knew the name. He'd seen it on a brass plate outside one of the cottages near the edge of the village. By dusk, he was standing at Briggs's door. The cottage was small and crooked, its roof sagging under decades of snow. He knocked once, twice. A shuffling sound came from within, followed by the creak of hinges. The man who opened the door was thin to the point of frailty, his skin paper pale, eyes clouded with age, but sharp beneath the haze. "You've seen it," Briggs said, his voice a rasp. Samuel hesitated. "The train." Briggs's gaze flicked to the fog beginning to curl along the road. "It isn't a train. It's a way. A way out for them. A way in for us, if we're foolish enough to step aboard." Samuel stepped inside at the man's gesture. The cottage smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like old coins. "They come when the fog's thick enough to hide the tracks," Briggs continued, settling into a worn armchair. "The man in the coat, he's not the conductor. He's the door." "The door to what?" Briggs gave a thin smile. "You think the train vanished into thin air?" "No. It still runs, just not here. Not in this world. And every few years, it stops to take on new passengers." Samuel leaned forward. "Why you? How did you get back?" The old man's eyes darkened. "I didn't come back. Not really. They let me go so I could warn the rest. But no one listens. They see the lights, they hear the bell, and they step aboard thinking they'll find warmth from the cold." Briggs's hands shook as he poured tea into 2 chipped cups. "It's colder in there than you can imagine. You don't feel your heart slow, you hear it. Like it's not your own anymore." The wind rattled the shutters. Outside, the fog pressed closer. Briggs set down his cup and fixed Samuel with a look that was part pity, part resignation. "Once you've seen them, you're already on the passenger list. They'll come again. They always do." Samuel left the cottage as the last light drained from the sky. The fog was thickening fast, coiling low around his boots. He hurried toward the station, Briggs's words echoing in his mind. When he reached the platform, he stopped dead. The ledger lay open on the counter inside, though he was certain he'd left it closed. The latest page was blank, except for the time, 1:13 a.m. And underneath, in neat, unfamiliar handwriting, 1 seat reserved. The night came early, as though the sun itself was in a hurry to leave Ashfield. By 5 o'clock the lamps along the platform were glowing in their own small halos of mist. The fog had already begun to roll in, not from the moor this time, but from the village itself, curling between houses, slipping down alleys, and winding toward the tracks like a living thing. Samuel sat at his desk, staring at the ledger. The words were still there in the same fine, precise script, 1 seat reserved. No smudge, no irregularity in the ink, as if it had been written with impossible care. He closed the ledger and locked it in the desk drawer, though he knew it would make no difference. The fog found its way into locked places. By 12:30 a.m., the station was silent. Snowflakes drifted lazily, but the air had that heavy stillness of a world holding its breath. Samuel paced the length of the platform, his lantern casting weak light into the swirling gray. At 1:05, the whistle came. Low, drawn out, carrying through the fog like the call of some enormous, unseen creature. At 1:08, the lights appeared. Two sickly yellow beams cutting through the mist, flickering as though struggling to stay lit. And at 1:13, the train rolled into view. It did not move like a train should. Its wheels turned slowly, deliberately, yet the whole of it seemed to glide, the fog bending around its iron frame as though the world itself was making way. The man in the coat was waiting by the first carriage, just as before. He lifted his head, and this time, Samuel saw his face clearly, if it could be called a face. The features were there, but faint, as though seen through frosted glass. Only the smile was sharp, too sharp, curving upward in a way no human mouth could. The carriage door opened. Warm light spilled out, not the cold glow of lanterns, but the kind of warm, golden light that made Samuel think of hearth fires and safe places. And then came the voices. Not whispers this time. Laughter. Conversation. Familiar voices. His father. A friend from years ago. Even the sound of a woman's voice he had not heard since he was a boy. It was impossible. And yet, his body moved toward the door. He placed one foot on the carriage step. The warmth touched him, seeping into his bones, chasing away the chill in his wrist for the first time in days. Samuel, the man in the coat said. His voice was calm, deep, and it carried through the fog without effort. You're expected. Samuel looked back toward the village. The lamps were barely visible now, swallowed by the mist. No movement. No sound but the slow hiss of steam from the engine. Another step. Inside, shapes moved, passengers, their faces turned toward him. Smiling. Waiting. One of them raised a hand in greeting. It was his father. Samuel's throat tightened. Then he saw it. The eyes. Not warm, not human. The same black pits he had seen in the man's face, staring from behind familiar features. The smile stretched too wide. The hands waved a fraction too slowly, like puppets whose strings were pulled by something unseen. Samuel stepped back. The warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a cold so deep he felt it in his teeth. The man in the coat tilted his head. Refusal changes nothing. The bell began to ring. Once. Twice. Each toll seemed to pull at Samuel's chest, as though his heart was being tugged forward. He staggered back another step, his boots slipping on the icy platform. The fog surged upward, wrapping around his legs. The last thing he remembered was the sound of the whistle, closer than it had ever been, and the man's smile vanishing into the mist. When Samuel opened his eyes, he was standing in the stationmaster's quarters. The fire in the stove had burned low. Outside, the world was silent and still. On the desk, the ledger lay open. The page was blank, save for a single line in that same careful handwriting. Passenger boarded.